We have some diversity on this panel. To first look, maybe it doesn't look that diverse. I know I'm worried Catherine Hamilton's going to accuse me of having a mantle here once again. But we actually do have some diversity. We've got commissioners from blue states and red states, right? And hopefully they'll get along as nicely as our previous panel. We've got commissioners from restructured markets and traditional markets. And we have two that are elected and two that are appointed. So there's some level of diversity here, and we'll keep driving that. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to run down the list so you know who we've got and from what states. Michael Picker from California. We've got Doug Little from Arizona, Travis Kavulla from Montana, and Kevin Hughes from Maryland. So you can see we do have some geographic diversity in there as well. I wanted to start big picture. We'll get into some details, and I want to encourage folks to jump up right away with questions. I've already been getting text messages with questions for this group of folks, and they've said everything. There's nothing off limits. So starting with docket number 75. No, just kidding. They did say things aren't off limits, but they do reserve the right to not answer if there's going to be a concern with ex parte or anything like that. But please jump on up and ask questions, and we'll do some polling as well. So the first, I want to start really biggest picture here, kind of in that spirit of the 51st state and the work we're doing around first principles. I recently, it's actually related to QER, got in a little Twitter battle this weekend about the concept of the regulatory compact, or the social compact around the power sector. And I've been in some conversations, some panels before where folks have been pretty adamant that there is no such thing as a regulatory compact, which is counter to how I've always thought about my dozen or so years in the power sector, that there is something fundamental that the utility is expected to provide in exchange for the monopoly franchise that they're granted. And so I'd like to hear from the panelists kind of your thoughts. A, is there such a thing as a regulatory compact? And B, if so, what is the definition of that in your mind? And C, how might that need to evolve? And as you're thinking about your answers, we'll pull up polling question, I think it's 13. I have a really loose definition on the question. I'm curious to get the audience's perspective while you guys think of the responses, and then we'll kind of get you guys to play off in a response. So who'd like to jump in first with that a response?
It's always Travis.
It's always Travis. Travis, you're first.
Okay, fine, Picker. I'll begin, and then people can contradict me. But I think if you looked in a lot of state statute books, you wouldn't actually find this regulatory compact statutorily defined. Yep. You find in some statute books a provision for exclusive service territories. You find certain other things like unreasonable or unduly discriminatory rates prohibited. You find an obligation to serve customers on reasonable request. But you don't have this quid pro quo, which is the regulatory compact as often understood and which appears on the screen. The thing historically, I think, to understand about the regulatory compact is that this business very badly at its genesis wanted to be regulated. And that's kind of a paradox. It didn't resist regulation, it wanted it. And the early Edison companies adopted regulation and forwarded it in state legislatures really for the purpose of putting their rivals out of business on an argument that they could gain an economy of scale to serve customers more efficiently. I think many economists would agree that customers are served more efficiently through a single monopoly, but it's paradoxical that this regulatory compact didn't really begin at the behest so much of policymakers, but of the industry itself, and as one, frankly, to tamp down on competition.
Yeah. So is that paradoxical because the compact puts some burdens or some obligations on the utility, or explain that a little, unpack that a little more?
No, I mean, I just say it's paradoxical because, Republicans like Doug and I kind of subscribe to this view traditionally that most businesses do not want to be encumbered by regulation. But obviously this type of regulation, this style of revenue regulation and economic regulation was viewed as something that could generate revenues, notwithstanding the transaction costs that it might impose.
Yeah. So any other perspective? Yeah, please.
It's interesting because in Arizona, we actually, as part of our constitution, are required as a commission to set just and reasonable rates and to set fair market value for the assets of the utilities. And back in 2007, during a court case that was basically Phelps Dodge versus the Arizona Electric Cooperative, the Court of Appeals said we cannot allow the market to set just and reasonable rates. We're not constitutionally able to relinquish that constitutional responsibility to the marketplace. And similarly, we can't allow the entities themselves, the regulated entities, to set what they consider to be fair value for their assets. So we actually have a constitutional mandate to enforce what you would consider to be a regulatory compact.
Yeah. Commissioner Hughes, President Picker, any response?
Sure, I would agree with both of those sentiments. I think in Maryland, it's not certainly in our statute either, but the Commission views the regulatory compact as something that's essential, I think, to how we regulate our utilities. And a great example of that is reliability. We had some, not only hurricanes, but we had a derecho all within about a 2-year period, which really questioned the reliability of our major utilities. And as a result of that, we implemented reliability standards that they had to meet. And what we heard from our citizens was that because they're a monopoly, it's their requirement to provide reliable service, and at the highest level is not an aspirational goal. It should be their duty. And that's how we view it, and that's how we try to enforce it.
President Picker, anything you'd add to that?
I have never entered into a regulatory compact.
All right.
So,
No one asked you to sign on the dotted line, huh?
Right.
nope.
So sounds like maybe there is, maybe there isn't, still not entirely clear. It depends on the Commission's perspective and how you define it, but generally some flexibility. I mean, is that what I'm hearing in terms of how you go through and figure out the obligation of the utilities?
There seems to be certain situations where the notion of one single buyer with a guaranteed repayment could, in theory, and probably practically, get cheap capital, buy a lot of stuff up front, get it in the ground, provide a service or a benefit, and then recover over time. As if you're a government agency and you're doing it on an annual budget appropriation or through long-term bonds, the costs are going to be high. So I think that's the theory. The question is when does that sole buyer actually become an impediment, and how do you actually then adjust to allow other people to move into providing those services, but without destroying the value that initial monopoly provided. And I'll just give the example of wooden poles. They connect everybody together. They go to most households in states that are served by any kind of electric system. They are not popular. I have not seen anybody coming to the PUC asking us to allow them to sell individual poles to individual consumers. But somebody has to put them in place and maintain them. And so is there a rationale for having a pole utility? Do you want to have too many people competing on opposite sides of the street? We tried that. It didn't work very well. And so I guess there's some nugget to this. But on the other hand, when you have potential mini servers who will come forward and provide electric service and do it in different ways that meet the needs of different customers, should that be a monopoly?
That's right.
And I think that President Picker's hit on something here that's very interesting. You see,
you want to sell poles?
No, not at all. In fact, that's one of the most contentious things that we deal with at our commission when we deal with transmission issues, is that people don't want the poles anywhere near where they live. But I think what's happened is you've seen the concept of a regulatory compact has evolved over time, because one of the questions that we were talking about a little bit earlier today in the utility panel was, what's happening in terms of the way that the industry is evolving, and in terms of the technology innovations and the way the industry is changing. People are asking their utility companies today for things that 25 years ago they never would have considered asking them for. And not only are they asking them for it, they're expecting the utility company to be able to deliver it, which is causing us as regulators to have to change the way we think about utility regulation. I mean, I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with me when I say that Bonbright, when he talked about his principles of rate making, envisioned anything like distributed resources, demand response, any of these things that we're grappling with today. Nobody even saw this coming. So we've had to sort of start rethinking how we do regulation in order to accommodate, these customer-driven needs, the changing environment that our utilities find themselves in, and just as you said, Michael, the other providers of services, including electric services.
Yeah. So let's see the poll results, and we'll continue this conversation. Needs fundamental reform. So only a few folks would say it absolutely does not exist here. I think we had something like 200, close to 200 responses there. Most folks think it needs some change and understanding, and I think we're hearing alignment with that here on the stage that's evolving. I'm trying to understand, is it really technology that's made that evolve, right? We've had a change in what we think the natural monopoly is originally when Samuel Insull and the Edison companies were putting this business model together, that it was everything from generation all the way through to the meter. And now in many states, in two of your jurisdictions, we've actually said, no, generation can be run separately. It's not part of the natural monopoly. And that was primarily, some change, something drove that. Maybe it was technology, maybe it was some understanding of the markets. What's driving that change? Is it technology? Is it the environmental consideration? How do you balance those things? Is it really just some other source for customers to want something different? I'd be really curious to get your sense of how these different drivers might weigh in here.
I'll be happy to start. I think technology plays a very big role in that. In Maryland, we now have over 80% of our residential customers have smart meters. And we as a commission have been thinking about, along with our utilities, how do we take advantage of that technology in a way that can monetize benefits for our customers. And that's part of our Grid of the Future proceedings that we've launched is to look at that. And one thing we're looking at in terms of promoting competitive markets is how our retail suppliers can use smart meter data to help provide services to their customers that don't exist right now, including time-varying rates for customers. So a lot goes into that, including how to protect that data and how to allow the customer to be in control of who has access to that. And those are processes we're kind of thinking through right now as we go forward.
Yeah, does that result in a change in what we expect from utilities? We had this, some places have resource planning, some places do not have a utility by utility resource plan. Are these technology having an impact there?
Well, I think that technology is really, I agree with my colleague from Maryland. I think that technology really is driving a lot of this, because if you look at the traditional grid, it wasn't designed for two-way flow. It wasn't designed to accommodate a lot of the things that we're trying to do now. So the technology that has been introduced to the grid is going to drive the evolution of the grid to support it, because, like I said, people want to be able to do these things. People want to be able to have DER on their rooftops. People want to be able to participate in energy efficiency programs. And that technology is pushing us to evolve the grid. And I think the other thing that I would observe is that if you look at one of the hottest sectors in the technology space right now, it's energy analytics. That's one of the hottest places that you can be right now. Companies like O-Power, recently acquired by Oracle, companies like First Fuel, companies all over the place that are getting involved in energy efficiency, demand response, energy efficiency for commercial and industrial companies, energy management. Those are the really driving industries right now in this space.
Yeah. What most excites you when it comes to technology and analytics. I'd be curious to hear from each of you in terms of if there's a particular new functionality that's available on the system you think has the biggest potential for change.
I think you really do need to go with the ability of demand to be more responsive. You know, in some ways, this idea that there would always be a monopoly market for generation and that utilities would always be vertically integrated, it was not really a technological revolution that destroyed that concept. It was really an evolution in economic theory. And when people like Paul Joskow theorized in the 1970s and 80s, originally created the idea of locational marginal prices and competitive generation supply going through day-ahead and real-time auctions. You know, that was kind of a revelation that the economies of scale and generation were not necessarily as persuasive as those in transmission and distribution. In other words, it pretty clearly doesn't make sense to duplicate two sets of poles and wires. Right. But to the degree that you can gain a market in generation, you know, it's not quite the same thing. But it's interesting, going back to those treatises about how competition was supposed to work, an essential building block of it was price-responsive demand. And that never really came to be for the better part of a couple decades until relatively recently, when people have been able to take advantage of time-varying rates, people have been able to take advantage of demand response programs, and whatever the sort of, you know, miscalculations of those rates or the nuance of those programs may be, it's definitely opened up a market as a result of technology, and has sort of realized something that is only, you know, theretofore had been a theory.
Yeah, so demand actually responding to a price signal is something that you think is maybe a fundamental change that will have that impact on the structure. Yes. Any other technological changes or capabilities that are coming on that are exciting? We talked energy storage definitely enables some of that. That was in our first poll of the day. Energy storage was the favorite technology in terms of change on our customer panel. But I'd be curious, you know, we heard analytics, we've heard energy storage. Kind of curious to hear what else you think will be fundamentally transformational.
I think giving people a way to conceive of all these opportunities, which is not simply a technological solution, it's more a understanding that people need approach that works with their values. So just about anybody who's done work on time of use rates comes to the understanding that there's only a portion of your customer constituency that responds. It's being thoughtful and responsible in your use of resources, respect the environment, screwing the utility. That's very popular, surprisingly enough.
We Americans hate monopolies, right?
They don't like paying bills, you know. They don't like people who tell the utilities to raise their bills, you know. It just comes with the turf. And particularly around demand services, demand response, I think that there's a big challenge we face because people get generation. They know about wind turbines, big things that whirl and make a whooshing noise. They know about steam generation and nuclear power plants and gas and coal because they can hear the steam, they can see the big facilities and the smokestacks. They understand solar because they can see the pictures. They can even see it on some people's roofs. But how do you make demand response real, concrete, and tangible? Because all those other technologies are moving electrons. Here, you're actually not using electrons. You're stopping the demand. You're stopping the flow. So you're creating stillness. So how the hell do you sell that? It's nothing. How do you sell nothing? And that's the challenge that I think we all face. And I'm sure that we'll crack that someday. But just as with solar, which people discounted for a great many years, and which is now actually firmly rooted in people's imaginations to the extent that they can't conceive of any other solutions to their energy problems, just like some of the early buzz about battery storage as being the silver bullet, the game changer. It's starting to emerge into people's consciousness. How do we get nothing into people's minds as a significant portion of the solution to our energy problems? Somebody will crack that, and when we do, we'll all be sitting around here and talking about different ways to sell nothing to different customers who have no need.
Well, the concept's been discussed before. The concept of the negawatt, right? One of our board members, Jim Rogers, had promoted that.
And most people don't know what watt is.
Right. Well, fair enough. So one solution potentially might be time varying rates. Commissioner Kavulla, you mentioned that.
So some solar company called that time of saving.
Okay.
I think a cautionary note needs to be sounded whenever someone asks regulators, well, what new technology looks exciting to you too? Because ideally, it shouldn't really be up to us to choose innovation. Okay. That's contrary to the whole idea that innovation will organically break through in response to price signals that are really supposed to be the emanation of need, or the lack of need for that matter. So, I mean, to the best of our ability, I think you try to set a relatively level playing field, and it feeds into this conversation that more people are having about performance-based rate making as well, trying to, like we were talking about in 2 panels ago, specifying some of the outcomes, having a long enough duration of a rate period to allow an incumbent actually to innovate within it. But on the other side of the coin, it's proved, given the public interest in energy and climate, it's proved irresistible to many policymakers, mostly legislators, though some regulators too, to sort of intervene in these markets and choose innovation rather than simply setting up the game to allow innovation to unfold.
I have to agree with Travis on that. I spent 30 years in the technology industry before coming to the commission. I watched many times product marketing groups come up with a solution, and then they went out and tried to figure out a market for the solution rather than turning it the other way around, figuring out what the market actually needed and then developing a product to deliver to a market need. I think the other thing is, it's really important, is we as regulators, we need to stay out of the prescription business. We need to not tell people how to go about it. We need to talk about outcomes. And the thing that comes to mind whenever I think about, regulators or legislators coming up with technology recommendations, I think about CFLs. There was a time that CFLs were designated as being the best way to reduce energy consumption and get away from incandescence. And now when I drop a CFL in my house, it turns it into a toxic waste site. LEDs were not even on the horizon, but now I think we'd all agree that LED technology is absolutely the way to go in terms of interior lighting. The market found a way to make it happen, not the legislators saying this is the best technology.
Well, to explore this concept, and before I ask each of you to explicitly endorse or not endorse PBR, performance-based regulation going forward, which I will do, this existing setup is really for the commissions to respond to proposals from the utility and decide, is this a reasonable investment and will it earn a return, or what will be the terms under which a revenue can be collected here. So it does seem that you are set up to not encourage necessarily outcomes explicitly as much as approve investments in technology. Is there something that needs to change fundamentally there? Do we need to embrace PBR, or is there something that can happen in the meantime in terms of our thinking or how we approach the regulatory process?
Well, just very quickly, I agree with the premise. I don't think you can have PBR if you're constantly playing the mother may I game. Regulation didn't actually used to look like that. I mean, utilities operated using their business judgment, and then after the fact, regulators would kind of sit in judgment over 5-6 years of their decision making. Now they had to get from other regulators permits for siting and that type of thing. But it wasn't, those permits usually didn't enter into inquiring about whether this was necessarily the least cost alternative or how rates would be made if indeed the project got siting. And now we have, we've moved to a more prescriptive mother may I form of regulation, I think it would behoove us to get out of that box, not necessarily to go back to the past as it exactly was, because it had its own problems, but to get back to a point where you're putting more of the business risk and considered judgment on people who actually work for the utility. Keeping in mind, too, that the reason why this Mother May I game is happening largely is because of the thing that I think I raised first, which is utilities love that. They love when a regulator signs off on it. And regulators, they kind of like being in the mix. Who doesn't want to be at the ribbon cutting, right? So people kind of need to understand their roles, in my view, a little bit better, and turn some of that business judgment back onto the utility shoulders.
It's always a challenge when you create a big market and then you create various places where individual technology providers can go leverage and get their technology preferred. So both the legislatures and the utility commissions sometimes get forced into that role. It's a challenge. I will point to a successful example where we narrowly avoided making that mistake, and that was after the San Onofre nuclear generating station dropped out of the grid. And we had to scramble to both meet the short-term need, but we needed a different way to approach some of the midterm and long-term needs. And so Commissioner Florio, my former colleague, said, go out and get whatever you can get as long as 50% of it is carbon-free. And so we got all kinds of weird things, including 200 megawatts of energy efficiency at the meter. We got about 200 megawatt hours of battery storage. However, it was actually behind the meter, and it was being used sometimes for the property owner to arbitrage the commercial and industrial rates for their own benefit. But for the critical peak days of the year, they became a grid service. They just flipped over on command. So all those things together are things that we still don't even have names for at the CPUC, but they actually work. And that was the measure, is go out and get stuff that works. And so the utility was fairly creative, and I think they deserve some credit for actually making a big effort to be able to create contracts and to set values for things that they couldn't be sure we were going to allow them to do.
But there's still a challenge because there are proposals that have come in, and then you will be evaluating whether or not these things should be invested in before the investment, as opposed to evaluating the performance after the fact, right?
Well, for the most part, we took them at their word, and we just used a general cost effectiveness tool. And so we tried to make sure, to the extent that we could, because we don't really have values for some of these things.
Okay.
Yeah. Do they make economic sense? Are they so far out of the market that they shouldn't work? And the utility, to their credit, discarded some of those things. I think that they knew that it would be hard, not just for us to swallow, but ultimately for ratepayers to swallow.
Sure.
So
right.
I think they were looking beyond us to actually meeting customer needs, and that customer needs was a fairly reasonable cost.
Yeah, I would add that at least in Maryland, all of the proposals that we would receive used to always come from the utilities. It was very rare that it was driven by the commission, but that's changed in the last, I'd say, 6 to 8 years. Now we see our General Assembly very active, especially on environmental issues and goals, requiring community solar programs to be developed through the commission, requiring energy storage, regulatory solutions to be developed by the commission. So that has created a much broader stakeholder process where we're working with all parties to try to develop programs going forward, not just from the utilities. And in terms of cost recovery, that will always be a big issue. In Maryland, for example, with our AMI meters, the commission decided to approve them but not grant any cost recovery until they came back and showed that they were cost beneficial, and required that the utility park those costs into a regulatory asset. Sounded great in theory, but it took a long time for the utilities to ramp up, to get everyone on board, and to be able to then show cost effectiveness. And so then we had the issue of a lot of money parked in a regulatory asset and potential rate shock when we finally did grant approval.
So what were the things that you found had cost benefit from the use of AMI?
Well, certainly the operational benefits of being able to read meters remotely, knowing when outages happen almost instantaneously, all of that could be clearly monetized. I think the biggest benefit we saw going forward was the ability to reduce demand and therefore reduce prices for customers. And we had to look at demand savings projections going out 20 years to satisfy us that the AMI programs were cost beneficial.
And did you use an avoided cost test? Did you use a other set of environmental standards?
We used typically we would use avoided cost tests, and then from PJM in terms of their projections of actual capacity of revenues, things like that. So.
Did they count it as capacity? Do you actually recognize
Yes,
it as
our
capacity?
utilities bid capacity, DR, and energy efficiency into the capacity markets.
We'll get around to that in the West later.
Maybe.
Well, no, I'm curious. I
50
actually
years.
enjoy this. You guys should keep going, and I'm going to sit back and maybe grab a drink. No, but I want to continue on this path with AMI because I think it is pretty interesting. Some of the thoughts earlier in the conversation were around, we know it doesn't seem like anybody else wants to compete on poles and wires. So clearly that's within the utility sandbox. But there are things where there are questions, right? Rooftop solar in Arizona, some of the utilities have come and said, hey, we'd like to play in that space. In California, charging infrastructure, Maryland charging infrastructure has come up. I know in Montana it's still more of a question on figuring out where they might want to play in DER. So I guess I'm curious, I want to come back to the AMI conversation on this role, but what are some principles that help you decide, where should they play, where should that line be drawn, especially in light of what we talked about with the changes from technology occurring and how that might change what is a natural monopoly type role or what is a natural obligation of the utility franchise, and where do you want to just let the market animate deployment of those functionalities or capabilities? So just principles I'm looking for, how you guys approach it.
I think for the question for us is who sets the market? Is it the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission? Is it the individual utility? Is it exist outside of that? What sets the market? What actually keeps it fair, transparent, and make capital liquid? I mean, so that for me, there's a lot of other questions that have yet to emerge. What are the impediments to allowing those markets to flourish? Is it only within certain areas, or do we actually take it all the way to poles? So
And I think part of the question is what market are you talking about? I mean, if you're talking about an RTO or an independent system operator, it's one way. If you're talking about vertically integrated utilities, it's something completely different because it's a different paradigm. I think the other thing that is a little bit concerning to me as a regulator, and one of the things that I'm grappling with right now is, does the market always make the right choice? Because, what we've seen, and this is a national conversation right now, what we've seen happen is in some of the organized markets, you're driving to the lowest cost per kilowatt hour. And some of the things that are important to the stability and resiliency of the grid, things like frequency and voltage support, things like those base load assets provide, those things have traditionally just come along for free when we had coal, when we had nuclear, when we had gas. The introduction of renewables has changed that equation a little bit. So if you're seeing wind coming into an organized market, and the wind producer is able to basically bid into the market at or near zero and make money on the PTC, the other assets can't do that. But they have to provide some of the other ancillary services that are necessary for the stability and resiliency of the grid. And maybe we're not valuing it properly.
Yeah, and at the same time, there's also the potential, right? In PJM, there's been talk that the market's not set up to properly value DR to come back, right? And to allow for that and try to balance the needs of keeping some of those resources on. But of course, it's interesting for you to bring up the point. You're in a vertically integrated market, so you don't have to struggle with that. Do you look to the organized markets and say, there's some things we want to pull in from that, or do you say, this is really good, what would we have?
Well, no, we do have to deal with it because, even though we're vertically integrated, we still participate in wholesale markets, and we participate, at least in the West, in the Western Energy Imbalance market. And, all those, like I said, it's kind of a intermingled world now. You can't be just completely vertically integrated and forget about everything else that's going on. Just the same way you can't rely completely on markets and let the market drive everything. And I've had some really interesting conversations with some people in organized markets about this concept. I think it's something that we're going to have to address, both as regulators and as an industry, because it's going to start affecting us. The thing that I look at, and I don't want to monopolize things, there is no national IRP process. In Arizona, we have an IRP process. We kind of figure out what the right balance is. But there is no national IRP process. And if you're familiar with the works of a guy named Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote a book called Tipping Point, if we can't see the tipping point coming and all of a sudden it tips, then what do we do? And right now we have no national view of what the integrated resource plan should look like.
And in this case, you're talking about grid stability or resource adequacy at a national
Right.
on a national level.
Right.
Well, we don't have IRPs per se in Maryland, right? Or
No, we don't. And that we ended that when we deregulated back in 1999. So it's, sometimes we wish we did. I can tell you that as a commission. And one of the things we're looking at now as part of our Grid of the Future proceedings is whether at least we need more of an IRP process for the distribution grid portion. And that's part of the concern we have with all the DR that's coming on board, especially solar, is that that owners will not know when feeders have the capacity to be able to absorb that type of DER. And so one of the things we're going to look at is something that one of our utilities, Pepco, is doing, which is to create kind of a mapping system where solar developers and homeowners can look and see how much capacity are on feeders and whether they're able to add resources.
Yeah. Let's go back to the AMI conversation, because one of the interesting things from an earlier panel was, sometimes in the regulated structure, it's tough to innovate and get approval. And thinking about if we did move to some sort of more performance-based regulation, you have to still set performance targets. And part of the exciting thing about AMI and that data is there might be lots of applications of that data that provide value beyond just being able to enable a time varying rate or the meter reading element of it, or maybe some operational preventive maintenance or predictive maintenance type functionality. There's a lot of things that people get excited about with this data. So thinking about, we talk about the potential for the role of the utility to shrink or modify, but also potentially to expand. How do you guys view that? If you're going to go with a set of performance metrics, how do you reconcile that with the idea there might be things that the utility may have that could create value outside of those metrics?
Well, I think you can look to some degree to the telecommunications industry for how some of this works. As it became increasingly obvious that telecom was going to become a competitive service with the advent of MCI Sprint, with cable companies beginning to offer voice services in duplication of traditional local exchange carriers, a lot of the typical reaction of state utility commissions was to say, okay, we're going to hold our price regulation of these services in abeyance. We're not going to stop rate regulating, but we're going to cap the rates basically, and maybe they'll increase year on year on an adjustment that's equal to inflation less productivity measures, but these guys are going to be capped. And a tacit recognition, in other words, that the rate caps no longer reflected necessarily the actual cost to serve. And under that cap, you then saw companies like CenturyLink and Verizon and AT&T not necessarily reinvesting in the old technology that was sort of becoming more and more obsolete. You saw them branching out into things you would consider more competitive industries, wireless telephony. They themselves bought some of the microwave communications that MCI Sprint had innovated. And that's kind of the way in which competition unfolded in that industry. It's in very stark contrast to the idea that we're going to allow innovation in the electric sector by simply allowing incumbent utilities to rate base more and more and more things, even things that third-party providers provide and don't get paid for on a basis of cost of service, but get paid on value of service from the willing buyer, willing seller transactions of our conventional imagining in the free market. Yeah. So if we're serious about allowing incumbents to sort of expand their ambit, I think we need to be skeptical about the underlying revenue model. You probably need to say cap those rates for a period of time in order to allow that innovation. And again, that you really can't do that if you have constant sort of not interference, because it's their sovereign right to interfere if legislatures want to, but involvement of the legislature in changing the rules of the game and giving prescriptive mandates every other year. It should be much simpler than it is. I mean, realistically, even if you're a state that's just gung-ho, clean and green, you probably should only need a couple policies to accomplish that, not 3 dozen.
Yeah. So if utilities are thinking about electrification of
I wish it was only 3 dozen.
Add another 0.
So we hear about EEI. They talked a lot about smart cities back at their conference in June, and there was folks talking about electrification of the transportation fleet, and that's a different set of how successful utility is supporting that is very different. There seems like there's a lot of potential, or if going into home management services and things like that through customer data, that seems like very much outside of the scope. And with the telecoms example, we're still challenged by the telecom industry, right? We've got great devices now. We all have incredible unlocking of potential, but we still have issues with rural broadband access, for example, and 911 charges and things like that we haven't solved and the like. So.
You just have to make those subsidies more explicit and a matter of public policy choice. I mean, that's the other side of the coin when you destroy or deconstruct the regulatory compact and you kind of admit that we're not going to subsidize things like expansion to everyone no matter where you live through regulated rates. You simply have to convert those things into a more explicit subsidy and make people vote on them.
Yeah, and that's a policy choice, not an explicit policy choice, but an implicit policy choice.
But I think there's another way to look at this, and so I'm going to just talk about expanding the industry in a different direction. I mean, basically the electric industry is providing energy that provides services, and so there are other markets or other commodities that compete out there, and technology is actually freeing up electricity to move into those markets more effectively. So I guess we're directed in California among several conflicting policies to actually drive the electric utilities to a greenhouse gas goal. And so we're choosing to focus on that because it's actually a broad goal, and to de-emphasize all the different technology carve-outs that the legislature has set forward. One of the things that you start to see when you look at that is that only 20% of the carbon emissions in California come from the electricity industry. 30% come from the use of gas in buildings and industry. 40% comes from transportation. We will not be able to meet our 2030 GHG reduction goal even if the electric utility went to 100% renewables. The challenge is actually, and people are not always conscious of it, but they actually have ordered us to drive this, is to help the electric utilities to find additional market share in the gas industry and in transportation. And so when you start to think about transportation then, and you start to think about the potential for vehicle to grid, if you think about the possibility of the utilities not just providing clean electricity to charging infrastructure, but actually building part charging infrastructure in much the same way that they built poles, if you start to look at them as actually possibly even giving people leases to electric vehicles as well as access to charging and a rate tariff, and then at the end of that, the utility owns the battery, so that as the two-way flows for vehicle to grid actually shorten the life of the battery, the utility has second life. There's a lot of potential for growth in the electric side of the energy industries. And the real question is who has the imagination to do it? If we put the electric industry on a larger reduction goal, taking it back to your performance-based rate making, would they in fact choose to go after cheaper investments in electrification of transportation over more expensive efforts to chase that last 5% of renewables? Damned if I know.
Yeah. Interesting. And the thing that makes it even more complex is you have a consumer involved in the whole process. Because ultimately, when you start to continue with your transportation example, here in the Washington, D.C. area, they have a very good public transportation system relative to a lot of other places. For example,
the red line this morning was
we have virtually no meaningful public transportation in the Phoenix metropolitan area. I mean, you know, it's a bus or you know, light rail, and neither one of them are very good, and neither one of them really are very well subscribed by consumers. But even though public transportation exists, and even though you have all kinds of good reasons to use public transportation, and even though it's climate friendly and it reduces the amount of emissions from vehicles, look at 395 at 7 o'clock in the morning. I mean, there's a bunch of people out there in their cars. And so what you're going to have to do is not just provide the infrastructure to enable the electric vehicles, you're going to have to change the minds of the consumers so they want to go out and buy those electric vehicles. And until that paradigm starts to shift, and the consumers start to see electric vehicles as being desirable and something that's going to meet their needs, it doesn't matter what we do, because it's their choice.
Yeah. I want to come back to electrification, but I do want to give Dan, he's been very patient, and one of our founders of this event, very patiently waiting there to ask a question. So please, Dan.
Yeah, and first let me say it's been a great day, so thanks to all of you who put it together. But there's been talk about rate recovery, and I want to put a fine point on that. The Missouri Commission, so many weeks ago, issued a ruling in a case of Kansas City Power and Light asking for rate recovery of its charging fleet that it had already put out there and was already deployed. But the commission didn't say that you couldn't recover the costs. It said we don't have the jurisdiction over charging stations. And I want to expand that into sort of the larger question of how blurry things are going to get downstream at that end of the grid from a jurisdictional standpoint. And then to add on to that, if you had a pen in your hand and were told you could mark up the Federal Power Act, what would you do?
That last one's pretty dangerous.
Let's actually, Dan teed up polling question 14. I'm going to put that up while you guys are responding to Dan's question. Buy a little bit of time while folks are looking for their clickers. So if we get polling question 14 up, Dan, it segues, it expands a little bit, but go ahead and respond to Dan's question while we're getting some polling in.
Well, one very quick hit maybe on the energy policy reform, not necessarily narrowly the Federal Power Act, but something that Tom and Rick mentioned up here is a reform of the hydro licensing process, which is currently bewildering and simply an extravaganza of rent seeking that incorporates so many things that have nothing to do with the question of whether this or that dam is safe and contributes or doesn't damage the ecology of the area. You know, it should not take a decade to get an 8 megawatt run-of-the-river dam relicensed. Right. So good on them for trying that. It seems to have bipartisan support. As to the other thing, you raised a really good question, and this is the thing about revenue regulation I'm trying to allude to. I mean, we've always, it's our bread and butter to say, sure, for the distribution system, we take your total amount of investment in capital, we have a depreciation schedule over a certain amount of years. That kicks out an annual sum of money that's returned to you as depreciation expense. There's a return attached to the undepreciated balance at some magic ROE we calculate, and then we add operating expenses to it, and then we take that total sum and divide it by your likely sales volumes. And that's the way, those are the rates you're legally permitted to charge. In the sectors where the utility industry is making investments that are arguably competitive, how should rates be set for those? It doesn't seem fair to set them on a cost of service basis when other people are competing in a way that is not based on their cost of service. So it either seems, I don't think it's necessarily the right answer to exclude the incumbents from the market, but it would seem to me you shouldn't allow two people playing for the same market to be compensated on a radically different basis.
Yeah, with respect to the charging station question, I think the response that I would first make would be who owns it and who's paying the bill. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who owns a restaurant, and it's a fairly large restaurant. It's very well attended during certain times of the year in Arizona where we have a lot of winter visitors. And he was asking me what I thought of whether or not he should put an EV charging station there. And I said, well, who pays for it? And he said, well, they'll install it for free, but I have to pay the electric bill. And I said, how much is the electric bill likely to cost? And he says, their estimates are like $3,500, $4,000 a month, and I'm not sure it would make sense for me to do that. That, to me, is a choice of an individual establishment and a commercial company coming together in a business arrangement. The idea being that more people would visit his establishment if they needed to charge their vehicles, if they were drivers of electric vehicles. I think if the utility company is the owner of that particular charging station, and they are charging a fee to charge at their station, then that might fall under the regulatory framework that we deal with. But the other one, I would say no.
Interesting. So Dan teed up the potential challenge of C, is where I'd bucket that. Arlen Orchard had on the previous panel had teed up A, this disconnect between the time frame you have to make decisions, what's happening with technology, and the implications of the decisions that you're making with technology. B is my personal, as a former executive in charge of a state energy office, I know I definitely felt B and know that my commission had challenges there. And of course, we have some theme of politics here. So I'd be curious to hear your response if there was one that you had to elevate above each of these, and then we'll see what our audience thinks in terms of the response. So. Commissioner Hughes. Oh well, we got that out there. So it is a fundamental. I mean, I'm curious to get your responses to this. Do you agree with this being the fundamental challenge that you're facing today?
Well, I think it probably is the biggest challenge. So A would be, and I noticed that in the morning question, one of the answers in terms of what are the biggest barriers, one of the answers was it's the regulator's fault, and every time that gets the most votes, and I think for all regulators, certainly in Maryland, we don't make decisions in a back room with no information. We have litigated hearings, we have evidentiary procedures, we have to build a record. We have a tradition of a robust stakeholder process when we make policy type decisions, and so all that takes time. We're trying, in terms of our grid of the future proceedings, we're trying to limit that to about 18 months before we kind of get policies out the door in terms of regulatory changes and new pilots. So we're trying to expedite things. But that gets me to your favorite, which is B, and I think for a smaller commission like Maryland, that's a really important a factor, and one we struggle with is having the resources really to do the analysis we need, independent from what the utilities give us.
Anything to add?
No, I generally agree. Again, what rate cap regulation, you can fire all your staff, you can put yourself out of existence. Basically, you just have someone monitoring the reliability of customer service, making sure that the utility isn't gaining so many efficiencies that it's cutting to the bone. I think if A and B are real problems for an institution, the default is almost something like a longer tenure performance-based rate making that doesn't have you playing the mother may I game and answering all the many questions you would have to about technology or deep analysis on this or that.
Yeah.
I'd have to go with A as being a big issue for me. Having spent as many years as I did in the technology industry, going to the commission was an eye-opening experience, because when we were in the technology industry, we could innovate and do it in a very, very short, reasonable amount of time to be able to take advantage of business opportunities. In the utility industry, because the regulatory lag is so long, it's very difficult for them to, in many ways, innovate the way they should. And then, on top of that, there are rules that they have to live by that make it difficult for them to innovate in ways that they probably should. And the example I'll give is having to use CapEx for software. They have to bring software on-premise and invest capital dollars in order to be able to rate base it, when something that makes much more sense would be to use cloud-based solutions, because the cloud-based solutions can innovate much more quickly. They're much more responsive to changes in load that the utility if the utility needs more of that service, they can very quickly get more of that service. Some of the data requirements that are coming from AMI, the amount of data that some of these utilities are dealing with now can be much more efficiently handled in the cloud. But they won't make the investments in cloud-based software because they can't get reimbursed for it.
But Commissioner, don't you have the authority to set up a regulatory asset?
Well, you see, here's the thing. The way the rules work right now, commissions follow what, generally speaking, are referred to as generally accepted accounting practice and FASB rules. And the FASB rules and general accepted accounting practice says cloud-based solutions are operating expense and can't be rate-based. So we're essentially saying to the utility, don't do the thing that makes the most sense economically because of these antiquated accounting rules.
Yep.
And those things should change.
Yeah. So we've got two more questions. I'm going to let Henry go first, A, because he's on an advisory council, but also because Gavin, I recently characterized him as the most dangerous person in this room as editor-in-chief of Utility Dive. So we're going to let Gavin ask the last question. Henry, who with ISO New England, why don't you tee us up?
Right. So since we're sitting in Washington with state regulators, I have to ask the question which involves jurisdiction. So we're trying to develop a grid where in the past, you had large central generating stations on a bulk power transmission system crossed interstate lines subject to FERC jurisdiction. The power goes into a distribution system, goes through a meter, retail sales subject to state jurisdiction. Very simple, straightforward. Now we're talking about putting resources in the distribution system. Maybe they're behind the meter, maybe they're just in the distribution system, maybe they export power into the grid. And we're trying to design a market and a system to accommodate that. And the question I have is, how do we regulate that? The jurisdiction does not seem to be very clear. Because you have these resources in the distribution system. Are they going to be subject to state regulation under average cost pricing, and it's competing with wholesale power resources that is in a competitive market, as you talked about? How do we settle the policy, the rate making, the conflicts that are likely to come up as we design this grid that is essentially going to become power flowing in different directions from different locations, and from different locations that were traditionally regulated by two different entities. So any thoughts about how you think that should work?
I mean, NARUC has a position, right? Just leave it to you guys.
Yeah, NARUC says leave the states alone. I think I can represent that on NARUC's behalf. I don't know. I candidly don't know. I mean, obviously, an extreme reading the other way would say your net meter, your rooftop solar arrangement is really a sale for resale, and that is a wholesale transaction jurisdictional to the Federal Power Act. Now, who's actually going to push that envelope, though? I have a really hard time imagining that anyone wants to push the red button on that one. I don't know. I mean, I hope we can just muddle along with our federal, counterparts and come up with an accommodation that respects both. Tony Clark has a very good recent white paper on how states can and should stick in their swim lane. I would encourage everyone to read it. I don't necessarily agree with everything in it, but he's a former state regulator and a former FERC commissioner, and I thought he did a pretty good job trying to chart some of these jurisdictional quandaries.
And he alludes to my favorite Johnny Cash song in it, so let's check that out. Check that out. Anyone else before we give Gavin the last question here? Wrap it up? No? Gavin, shoot.
All right, I don't know how dangerous this question is, but I will say I want to just note that maybe it's an indication on how far we've come in some DER regulatory debates in the past few years that Commissioner Little didn't choose option D up there, which is politics. But I thought that was funny, guys. Come on, Arizona politics. Okay. Got to read the dive, guys. Okay, the real question is actually on performance-based regulation. So we did this big survey of utilities like we do every year, and we asked them, what do you think the appropriate regulatory model is for the 21st century? And the strong inclination from a majority of respondents was that they don't want traditional cost of service regulation. Only 8% chose that. They also don't want all the way over to PBR. Only like 12% chose that. What most people want is a hybrid cost of service with PBR layered right on top of it. And I was presenting this to one of the committees at NARUC last week, and I believe it was Commissioner Lang looked over at me afterward, and she said, so they want to keep rate basing all the stuff they've been rate basing, but then get paid to do the right thing on top of it, or something to that extent. And honestly, when I look at that data, that's the cynical take on it, right? Is that they're pushing for this PBR because they see opportunities for bigger revenues, whether it's in New York or wherever else they're pushing for these things. But then they also, as we've seen in the Rev docket, they will jealously protect the ability to, rate base their assets that they've always rate based. So I wonder, just from your perspective, if you see, if a hybrid model of cost of service PBR can work, and how do you kind of limit that ability of utilities to, maybe if you're trying to transition them out of cost of service, how do you get them to do that when really they've been rate basing everything under cost of service for so long? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it's a dangerous question, so I appreciate you living up to my expectation there.
Well, I'll start and try to be quick because I know we're at the end. So we've had a few proposals for performance-based rate making, and it's been tied to reliability, and we've really struggled with it. They've been very general, so we have not seen a specific proposal which would allow us to do any type of transition away from traditional rate making. And part of it is number D, politics, I think, because a lot of our citizens view reliability as the responsibility of utility, and we should not give them extra incentives to do what is their job to do. And the other issue with reliability is very dependent on weather in terms of actual SAIDI and safety results, and we've not even begun to figure out how can you kind of separate that and put it aside so it doesn't become part of the incentive equation.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Commissioner Lang's reading of the situation, and I guess I'd say that credible performance-based rate making is more of a substitute for cost of service regulation, not an additive element to it.
So I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian here and say this. Traditional cost of service and traditional rate making is largely based on assumptions that were in effect in the 1960s. I would submit that since the 1960s, the world has changed rather dramatically. And perhaps it's time to have a conversation. Perhaps NARUC can be the instigator of the conversation because that organization brings together people from the industry. It brings together people from consumer organizations, from NGOs. They all are part of the NARUC meetings. And I think maybe we need to have a conversation on what the regulatory model for the 21st century looks like. I think that's where I would go with it. I think we need to rethink the whole paradigm and come up with something that makes sense for the world we live in today.
I'm going to wait to see if any of these guys are successful and then steal their best ideas.
It's not how we think about California moving.
Really?
Yeah,
you're
it's
wrong.
a little different. So we're going to hopefully have these guys around for drinks in a few minutes, and we can continue these conversations. And we will let NARUC work on it as well, but we're going to work on it here at SEPA at this summit. So please join me again in thanking this great group of folks.